बादल पर फूला है किस दौलत पर फूला है किस दौलत पर फूला है बादल पर फूला है ये माल बंद और नाते हैं सब यहाँ के यहाँ रह जाते हैं मन समझ समझ तू समझ जरा सब झूठा है हर नाम खरा यह इनायत गाते हैं सब नैन नीर भर लाते हैं
Inspirer of my mind, consoler of my heart, healer of my spirit, thy presence lifteth me from earth to heaven. Thy words flow as the sacred river, thy thought rises as a divine spring. Thy tender feelings waken sympathy in my heart. Beloved teacher, thy very being is forgiveness. The clouds of doubt and fear are scattered by thy piercing glance. All ignorance vanishes in thy illuminating presence. A new hope is born in my heart by breathing thy peaceful atmosphere. O inspiring guide through life's bustling ways, in thee I feel abundance of blessing. Amen.
Now I will tell you how Murshid Inayat Khan actually came to Holland. In January 1921, my parents in Rotterdam received a letter from an acquaintance of ours, Miss Katwijk from Amsterdam, who asked us if we would like to receive a philosopher from India, who wanted to give lectures here in Holland, and if we could have him stay with us. She knew that Rabindranath Tagore had stayed in our house a year before and thought we would like to receive this Indian man as well. This was Murshid's first trip to the Netherlands. I was not yet married at the time, and I was still with my parents. As we had just come home from a long journey in southern countries and were planning to travel again for the years in the next month, our house was not in the appropriate condition to accommodate guests, and we asked her to make an effort to find shelter elsewhere. But lo and behold, things were going to be different. Murshid came from Switzerland by train to Rotterdam, and the Dutch nurse Miss Corrie Smith, who also became Murid in Switzerland, accompanied him. On arrival at the Maas station Rotterdam, there was no one there to pick up Murshid. Murshid did not know the name or address of the family where he was expected. He only found the address of my parents in his pocketbook. Mr. Smith called us, and my father said, "Just take the taxi and come to our house." So it happened that Murshid suddenly stood in front of us, an impressive figure, silent, powerful, and I would say, warm-hearted. We had just come home from a 7-month stay in southern Morocco, and were used to the regal but friendly dignity of the Eastern Qaids. But this Inayat Khan was something else entirely. We did not even know what religion he belonged to. He came at the time we were to have the coffee meal, and at the table he was asked about his country of birth and religion. To our great joy, he turned out to be a real Sufi. My mother had taken a course on the ancient Sufi poets from Persia and had always urged us to read about them. Yes, in Morocco we had repeatedly inquired whether there were any Sufi poets there, but we found none. And now there was the real Sufi we were looking for. That evening, Murshid gave us a lecture in the Theosophical Lodge. We went there, but we were not particularly impressed. But the contract had already been made, and that was deeper and of more value than all the words of the short speech. Shortly afterwards, Murshid moved from England to France, to a small village south of Paris called Wissous. I had asked Murshid in Brussels if I could learn with him that summer, and so it happened that instead of traveling to far eastern countries, we went to that small rural village of Wissous near Paris. During the time, Murshid Inayat Khan lived in Wissous with his wife, children and 2 brothers. My parents had rented rooms in that village, first in a farmhouse and later in an 18th century country house with a nice, somewhat wild garden. There was an old French housekeeper who cooked for us. When we moved in, Murshid was still traveling in Switzerland with Van Tuyll, who was then Murshid's secretary. While we were waiting for Murshid, we heard that also other Murids were coming. It was said that there would be an English lady and a Dutch lady, and later Van Tuyll would also be there. So we went looking for rooms for them, which Murshid's wife, Begum Inayat Khan, had asked us to do. My mother and I searched the whole village because there was no hotel in that village, no boarding house, and so on, and after a long search we found rooms for Miss Goodenough in one corner of the village, Miss Vernay from The Hague in another corner. During the morning in Wissous, Murshid always sat in his garden and did not speak, so Murshid kept silence in the morning, and the children played around him. Murshid asked me if I would draw his portrait. Then I could come and sit in the garden every morning. I did know that watching Murshid would confuse me more than ever, so I did not dare to do it. I put it off in the hope that there would be a time for it later when I would have become more clever at the craft. My opportunities to draw a live portrait never came again. Later, when Murshid lived in Suresnes, there were so many people for interviews that it was impossible to find time for them. And that gave me years of remorse. Then, from memory, I also made a watercolor of our evening meetings. Every evening between 9 and 9:30, we met and waited in Murshid's garden behind the house until we were let into the large room through the glass garden door at 9:30 in the evening. There was an atmosphere of peace and tranquility. Nothing disturbed that rural silence. I will do my best to take you back to the atmosphere of Wissous, which was so completely different from that of Suresnes. So when we were let into that room, we would settle down on the chairs in a circle with Murshid, while Murshid's brothers played on their vina and sitar somewhere in the back of that large room to accompany our singing. Behind Murshid was a petroleum lamp without a shade, spreading a dreamy light in that dark room. There were flowers and usually some incense sticks were burning among them. We first held a silence and then we did the zikr in the complete form with all the shortenings and accompanying movements. This all was done while chanting. Wissous prayers, psalm and salat. Then a silence and then standing in rows with Murshid in the middle of us in the first row, and of course facing east, we did the prayers, psalm and salat, usually said by Miss Goodenough. Then we left the house after saying goodbye to Murshid and family. Murshid and Amina. Sardar and I went often for a walk, and often saw Murshid going out for an evening walk with Begum through the fields also. We'd hide in a cornfield to watch Murshid and Begum go by in the semi-darkness. The colors of late evening turned everything blue. On the hilly terrain, with here and there the dark silhouette of a haystack, stood out against the blue night sky. Everything breathed the air of peace. We eat together. Sometime on Murshid's birthday or Hidayat's birthday, Murshid asked us to eat together. There were often mourids from Paris, like 3 or 4 or 5, but not many. Begum sat at the other end of the table and handed out food on plates. Usually meatballs and rice or small cooked pieces of meat in curry sauce and rice, really oriental. Then rice with saffron for dessert, which is oriental feast food. On the table was the kerosene lamp without a shade, and we blinked, for it was quite a nuisance. At first I wanted to go to Paris to find a shade for it, but I didn't think it was a good omen to buy something that would obscure or screen the light in Murshid's house, so I didn't do it. There was a glass with some marigolds from the garden on the table. Murshid spoke little, but occasionally addressed someone in the circle. It was an impressive gathering and was reminiscent of the supper with Jesus. Murshid in a thunderstorm. One day, on a Sunday, Wissous had quite a few visitors from Paris, in Murshid's garden. It was in August and a thunderstorm was suddenly threatening. The sky darkened and the brisk wind picked up. Begum, the brothers, children, and visitors quickly fled into the large room. I was last, and just about to open the glass garden door to slip in too, when I looked back to see if Murshid was coming too. What I saw then I can never forget. Murshid stood quietly like a grand figure, defying or taking in the storm on a low hill. The arid blisters and dust swirled, driven by the wind, around him. His hair was blowing in the wind. He stood there like a prophet from the Bible, a Moses, an Abraham. He did not notice that I saw him. Inside, the visitors and children were cackling. Outside, the contrast of the eternal forces of nature in their greatness with Murshid. This moment remains etched in me forever, and later I tried to capture it in a watercolor. You will now be interested to hear something about Katwijk and the summer school there. Serdar and I were married at the time and we lived in a large house with 2 large studios in Katwijk aan Zee. Serdar had rented 2 houses for accommodation for the mourids. Miss Green, who later became Murshida, stayed with us. In the large studio upstairs, Murshid gave a lecture in the afternoon and evening. In the afternoon, Murshid talked about social problems, and in the evening he gave the lectures, which became the book Inner Life. In the evening, Murshid did not sit on a chair, but on a small pedestal with stairs, over which he had laid a large Persian carpet. Murshid sat on it with his legs crossed. Every evening after dinner and before evening reading, Murshid went to the beach. Our house was the last, but one house on the Strand Boulevard. He stood with us at the water's edge until the waves came and almost touched his feet. He would stand there silently, and the fishermen and children of the village would come to the edge of the dunes or in the distance to the beach and watch silently, but not one of them would ridicule Murshid. We looked at the sun slowly setting lower, but before it touched the horizon, Murshid turned around and went home. Murshid said it was not good to look at the setting sun. It made an impression of leaving or ending. The Persian poet Jalaluddin Rumi also said, "I don't like suns that set." I was in the habit of getting up a little early and walking along the beach. One morning a fisherman came up to me and called out, "Lady, it's beautiful sailing weather. Do you want to sail?" I suddenly thought whether Murshid wouldn't love this sailing and ran home. Murshid came to tell me that the fisherman should have the boat ready. We would come to sail. We were 11, so with the fishermen 12 people. Now, such a boat cannot get further on the beach than the surface, and the fishermen had to carry us all from the beach into the boat. But the English Murshida protested very much, and only when she saw how Murshid was carried to the boat on the fisherman's back, she gave in also. We sailed at sea for about an hour, and Murshid's face was beaming, anticipating from the highest seat in the boat. For us, an hour of intense beauty and symbolic meaning. Murshid was the last to leave the boat, and so it happened that he was photographed standing by that fisherman holding him. At Christmas 1922, this photo became Murshid's Christmas greeting to his murids. Visit Sikh Murid. After the evening reading, when all the murids had left, Sardar went out with Murshid to the last small street in the village, a few steps beyond where we lived. There stood one of those rented houses. It was just a very small fisherman's house, and it was rented for Mr. and Mrs. Knoop Koopmans. Because Mr. Knoop Koopmans was very ill and had to stay in bed, making it possible for Mrs. Knoop Koopmans could go to the lectures. Murshid would visit the Sikh Murid late at night. Sardar accompanied Murshid to the beginning of that sandy street where a lantern illuminated the path somewhat. Murshid then would walk alone to the cottage and would knock softly at the door and would stay inside for some time. Sardar would wait for Murshid by the lantern. This was always late in the evening, and there would be no curious looks, as the villagers were also asleep in Katwijk. It was exactly a picture from biblical times. Murshid's figure in his black burnous and his black fez on contrasted with a little white church with the illumination of the moon above it. And Murshid's figure there by the sea was also curious to outsiders. Some Katwijk fishermen, who often stood watching at the end of the Zuid Boulevard, and when Murshid passed by, then respectfully saluted, and I was told that it seems to them as if they saw the Lord Jesus Christ walking again around the earth. One day after lunch, Murshid went for a walk in the dunes with Miss Green and Saida van Tuyll. Back home, Murshid told me that he had named a certain high dune, which he had climbed alone, leaving his two murids behind. The name was Murad Hasil, meaning wish granted. Smiling, Murshid added, "In that place, people's wishes will be fulfilled." What was the meaning of this? We did not know then. But Murshid never spoke about it again to me during his life. Then I made Murshid 3/4 seen from behind. It is a symbol of his laying down the veena to give only the message from now on. In those days, Murshid vowed never to play veena again. Murshid described this in the piece Murshid uttered or dictated, which was also printed as an introduction in the French Guyane. In Wissous, Murshid often played for us in his room or sometimes in the garden, and he sang beautifully. Murshid's voice was so touching, so human. I have never heard any Indian musician sing like that. And Murshid loved to do it. He loved to sing for us, and many times he played for us in the garden in the afternoon, and we could never get enough of listening to it. But those who later became Murid and went to Suresnes never heard Murshid sing or play again. In Suresnes, Murshid gave lectures in the hall, which was built at the end of the plot of land opposite Murshid's house. In the beginning, there was no electric light there, and only a small kerosene lamp stood in the hall. After the evening lecture, Murshid came down from the stage and stood between the murids in the first row. The light was then placed on the floor on the stage. I always stood in the first, second, or third row, but there were sometimes almost 200 murids in the hall. I never looked behind, however, so I painted from memory what I had always seen in front of me. The light from the lamp gave a beautiful soft light in the room. The next year, everyone was happy that electric light had come on, but I was sorry because the beautiful effect was gone. One of the Murids next to Murshid said the prayers. Murshid himself only did the movements but did not speak. Sardar often stood next to Murshid and then sometimes said the prayers. It may interest you to know how Murshid did the motions at the prayers. While many Murids often make exuberant movements and spread their arms wide, with Murshid everything was much more controlled. They were the same movements, but silent and humble, sober and small. At the words, "Pour upon us thy love and thy light," Murshid's hands remained close to his chest and not very apart. Later, when Murshid had passed away, I regretted so much that I had never drawn a portrait of him, that I decided to make an attempt to depict Murshid from memory in my own way, as illustrations. At first, I dared not paint him from the front or the side out of respect for Murshid. So I began to paint Murshid from behind, as you can see from the film where he walks to the hall. Next to that little path where Murshid walked when he went to the hall to give a lecture, every day a girl from Holland sat. She was not Murid, did not know English either. She was the caretaker of a deaf and dumb child of the Van Horn family. She sat down at that path every time to watch Murshid go by. Then Murshid greeted her, which she considered a great blessing. In later years, she became Murid. Sardar and I were the only Murids who did not go home, but hid behind bushes to watch Murshid return home. Musharaff Khan was the one who fetched Murshid. That is, he walked very slowly in front and Murshid walked a step or two behind him. I think that Murshid, still half impressed by the meditation, had enough help to find the way home to the dark garden by following the figure of Musharaff. Murshid walked very slowly and it seemed to us that he was almost translucent or unreal. Then we returned home in silence ourselves. The last day before Murshid left for India, I asked his permission to make a few sketches during the lecture. I still have these, and they show a peculiar posture of his hands while speaking. Many of you may have heard that before giving his lectures, Murshid used to sing an invocation prayer. Many times before he began to speak, I heard Murshid sing that prayer. It was so beautiful, so moving, and I can tell you that there were people who just came to hear that one prayer sung. There was a Frenchman who said to us, "Yes, what Murshid says does affect me, but I come for that one prayer, which surpasses anything I have ever heard." The family members wanted to write down that song with notes, but since Murshid sang it slightly differently each time, that was extremely difficult. Nevertheless, they once wrote it down for me and it was also printed and existed on a small sheet of paper with Arabic letters for the words and also with an English translation underneath. Murshid has ceased singing that song of invocation when people in America were suggesting that he might hypnotize the listeners.
سبحان ذي العزة والعظمة والهيبة والقدرة والكبرياء والجلال والجمال والكمال والجبروت سبحان الملك المعبود سبحان الملك المقصود سبحان الملك الموجود سبحان الملك الحي الذي لا ينام ولا يموت ولا يفوت أبدا أبدا سبوح قدوس ربنا ورب الملائكة
ولا يموت ولا يموت أبدا أبدا سبوه قدوس ربنا ورب الملائكة والروح.
Beloved one of God, Sufi message is the message today being given to humanity. It is not a message of the East, but it is a message of the soul, the spirit. The Sufi word means wisdom, which comes from the root Sophia. It is the work of that wisdom to give the message today to humanity in order that people may come together in a better understanding, arising beyond the different sections of caste and creed which divide mankind. The Sufi message is an answer to the cry of humanity today. At this moment, when materialism is all prevailing and commercialism is continually on the increase, the Sufi message respects all religions, recognizes all scripture, regards all the prophets held in esteem by large sections of humanity, and sees the source and goal of all is wisdom in one. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allah ilaha illallah, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Walillah